There is a largely hidden crisis heading towards Canadian churches, and the vast majority of Canadian Christians have no idea. How many Canadian Christians, for example, do you think know about the fact that the Standing Committee on Finance released recommendations at the end of last year suggesting that tax-exempt status be removed for the purpose of spreading religion? I'll bet not many. Almost nobody covered it. And at the same time, this move would cripple churches. So let me read to you directly from the 2025 budget report published by the Standing Committee on Finance. They had two recommendations that really stood out to me when I was looking through this report. Recommendation 429. No longer provide charitable status to anti-abortion organizations. Now, this has been a long-standing policy of obviously the Trudeau government and presumably also of a future Mark Carney government if he in fact gets reelected. But recommendation 430, again, got almost no mainstream coverage, but is incredibly important. Amend the Income Tax Act to provide a definition of charity which would remove the privileged status of advancement of religion as a charitable purpose. So to spell this out, if you donate to a religious institution of any kind, then you get the institution in question has tax-exempt status, you will get a portion of your donation back. If this was removed, the primary sources of income for houses of worship in particular would dry up to a large extent. People would be able to donate way less. If they were to get taxed on all of their properties, this again would cripple many institutions who are already dealing with a crunch in many areas of this country because church attendance has been dropping precipitously over the last 4 decades. And so you might ask, why in the world would the Canadian government even float this as a recommendation from the Standing Committee on Finance? This has been going on for quite a while. The government has been step by step building the case for essentially defunding, stripping charitable status from religious institutions that disagree with them on the LGBT movement. And it's interesting because there have been mainstream stories that I thought Christians should have paid a lot more attention to, where you saw these ideas getting kind of floated, where you could see where the attacks on Canadian churches were going to come from once they really ramped up. So there was one story, for example, in 2018. This was a report in the Toronto Star, Canada's largest and most liberal newspaper, and they published a report about an Oshawa woman, who was removed from the membership rolls of Calvary Baptist Church because she was in a long-term same-sex relationship. And this conflicted with the values of Calvary Baptist Church, and therefore she could not be a member of that church in good standing. Now, in response, a local LGBT activist named Mac Moreau launched a letter-writing campaign requesting that the Canada Revenue Agency review the church's charitable status. So to review the charitable status of the church because someone who is in a same-sex relationship could not be a member of good standing, could obviously still attend church, all of those things, but couldn't be a formal member of the church. Now, listen to what Moreau's defense of that was when he was speaking with the Toronto Star. The church has allowed its resources to be used for activities that promote hate and intolerance. If you are going to promote hate and intolerance, you shouldn't receive benefits from the Canadian government that all Canadians contribute to. Moreau said that his campaign intended to serve as a warning to all churches that preach intolerance, by which, of course, he means any church or any other place of worship that adheres to a biblical or traditional values on sexuality and gender. Then he said, this isn't meant to destroy a church family. This is simply to say, in this day and age, when you're receiving benefits from the public purse, this is simply not acceptable. Now, of course, many of these churches aren't receiving government money. They have tax-exempt status, and people who donate money to them can get some money back. But Moreau makes it very, very clear. If you disagree with the Trudeau government or the Carney government's position on things like LGBT issues, then you should actually have charitable status removed, which was recommendation 430 in the report of the Standing Committee on Finance last fall. And again, almost nobody discussed that. There was a second story published right around the same time, also in the Toronto Star, that really caught my eye. And this is something that the majority of Christian churches have not thought about, but need to begin thinking about. And it highlights a key vulnerability that many churches and ministries have not considered, which is that many of their public communications, including online sermons, can and are being viewed, listened to, and saved by LGBT activists who are building the case for stripping charitable status away from churches, just as Mac Morrow said. And so in this instance, in this story, it was a priest from the Roman Catholic Diocese of Calgary, and he had condemned the LGBT flag and stated that this constituted a break from the natural order. And he had cherry-picked quotes from his sermon, which was basically just a pretty banal recitation of the Orthodox position on these issues, cherry-picked by Christopher Wells. You may recognize his name, who was then an associate professor at MacEwan University, but is now a Justin Trudeau-appointed senator. He accused the priest of, quote, declaring open season on LGBTQ youth. So here's a priest just basically stating the fundamental Christian view on sexuality and sex. And what does this former professor, now senator, say? That he's declaring open season on LGBTQ youth. And this rhetoric is being used very deliberately. We have seen LGBT activists over the last number of years laying out their case for targeting any Christian institution that does not bend the knee when it comes to LGBT ideology. And that reminded me of an essay from Carl Trueman a while ago. And he said something that I think is worth emphasizing in the magazine First Things. He said, I would anticipate that within 5 years, we will witness a significant disruption across all major representatives of the Christian faith. The fault lines will run between those who find a way to accommodate to the world's terms of good citizenship and those whose fidelity to Christ will lead to varying degrees of internal exile within this earthly city. The former will ultimately accept the collapse of biblical anthropology, repudiating its implications for sexual morality, for human identity, and for addressing the various socially constructed problems we now face, such as those of race and gender. The latter will maintain Christian teaching and be decried as being at best naive, at worst bigoted. This is what we are seeing. It's very interesting because especially in Canadian coverage, if you look at the CBC, if you look at a lot of the mainstream news outlets, they are happy to give churches positive coverage, but they choose the United Church. They choose the, once great Canadian Anglican Church. They deliberately choose churches that fly the trans flag, that have Pride Month services. That's a thing. And then they contrast those churches with churches that still hold to a biblical anthropology, as Carl Trueman put it. So a couple of years back, when there was a church in Norwich, Ontario, in Oxford County that was getting protested by LGBT activists, they actually focused, the press not only demonized that church, but they focused on another local church, a United Church, I believe it was, but focused on their Pride services and how the female pastor, which I happen to think is a contradiction in terms, but on the female pastor's embrace of LGBT ideology. So the media is essentially trying to say, here's what a good Christian church looks like. Here's what a bad Christian church looks like. And so we might say, well, if they attack the Christian churches, we'll defend Christianity, but they're going to be trickier than that. They are, in fact, being trickier than that. They're endorsing a Christianity that's willing to hoist the colonizing LGBT flag over their institutions and bend the knee. And then they're using those churches as a stick to beat Orthodox churches with. That is, small O Orthodox. Now, those of you who are listening and thinking, okay, it was, recommendation 430 in a standing committee on finance report that nobody read. This is not something that the Canadian government is ever going to do. Why in the world would we be so worried about this? This would actually cause a massive blow to the Canadian social ecosystem. No politician would embark on this. I want to remind you of a few things. The first thing is that in Canada, only 11% of Canadians attend any form of worship, even monthly. That's not just churches. That's churches, gurdwaras, temples, mosques, synagogues. So that means 89% of Canadians do not attend any form of worship regularly. Second of all, that number includes people who still bother to get out of bed and go to the United Church on a Sunday morning and they literally have an atheist pastor at one of the United Churches. So that includes the sort of post-Christian mainline churches. Now, this means that a lot of Christians, our view of the country is often shaped by the communities we're part of, and we can wildly overestimate how many Christians there really are in Canada, and we can wildly overestimate how protected and how safe we are from a government that genuinely views many of our beliefs as genuine bigotry simply because we haven't changed our values and we hold to the same values that we have as laid out in Scripture for thousands of years. And so, one, it's incredibly significant that a recommendation to remove charitable status for furthering of religion was even in a committee report from the Standing Committee on Finance. That is a big deal. But second of all, what most of you probably are unaware of is that the Canadian government has also been carefully building its case to strip charitable status from churches, or more specifically, any church that is out of line with the values that they hold, and now the values that many people like LGBT activist and Senator Christopher Wells holds when he says that a statement of biblical orthodoxy on sexuality is open season on LGBT youth. Look at how incendiary that is. So, how many of you have heard of this report? It is titled, "The Rainbow Faith and Freedom Worshipping with Love Final Report." The subtitle is "Exploring Experiences of Religious-Based Homophobia and Transphobia in Places of Worship." This was a government-commissioned report. It says here on the front title page here that it was funded by Women and Gender Equality in Canada and the Canadian government's Department on Women and Gender Equality. So, what does this Canadian government document with the Canadian government logo right on it have to say? It's incredibly interesting, and it's very interesting that you get this recommendation, and then you have a report that essentially justifies that recommendation being released in short order. Almost no Canadian Christians have heard of this report, despite the fact that it analyzes Christian places of worship. And then, of course, has some recommendations. So here's a note at the beginning of the report here. This research was generously funded by the Women and Gender Equality Canada, executed by Kayla Musait and Gabrielle Praise-Forrester, written by Kayla, and supervised by Dr. Stephen Lowe and Reverend Brent Hawks. He's one of the good ministers. And then a special thanks to a wide range of other different researchers. Now, their opening page here just shows a lesbian couple embracing with the phrase, "Imagine a world where religions don't see gender identity, so all people can practice their faith free from discrimination." Now, what are they talking about? Well, they very handily lay it out for us on page 4, where in bold it says, "The problem." This is what the problem is, according to this government-funded and commissioned report. Although Canada is a leader in 2S LGBTQ+ legislation, many people in different sectors of Canadian society still experience homophobia and transphobia. Equality in law does not mean equality in lived experience. 2S LGBTQ+ discrimination in Canada exists despite progressive legislation. And again, we're defining the problem here. This has led to higher rates of suicide, addictions, and mental health issues in these communities. So they're identifying the problem, and the problem is directly responsible for suicide, addiction, mental health issues. It has also led to higher rates of unemployment, hate crime, and marginalization. Notice this incendiary language here. Discrimination is often justified by religious belief by different faith traditions in communities. RFF is a unique Canadian organization because it recognizes that religious-based discrimination is a problem and the most powerful and influential source of homophobia and transphobia in Canada. So if you are a Christian who holds to the biblical definition of sexual morality, if you're a Reformed Christian, an evangelical Christian, if you are a devout Roman Catholic or a devout Orthodox Christian, you have been identified on page 4 of a government report as the problem, and that your belief system actively contributes to higher suicide rates, rates of mental illness, and all of these things. This report was released almost in conjunction with a recommendation that charitable status be pulled, tax-exempt status be pulled from churches. So what is the purpose of this report? It's handily provided for us right after they define the problem, which, again, is many places of worship. Though RFF has a global mandate to end religious-based discrimination, this particular research project is focused on Ontario, Canada, which, of course, is Canada's most populous province, and achieving inclusion and equality for 2S LGBTQ+ people. As part of this research project, over 3,000 Ontarians were surveyed and 12 were interviewed about their experiences with religious-based homophobia and transphobia in places of worship. And this report outlines those findings. Again, how are they defining religious-based homophobia and transphobia? It's just expressions of the orthodox view on gender and sexuality. This is a government report. So what are their key findings? Let's take a look at what those are. The lived experience for most 2S LGBTQ plus folks in Ontario is one of exclusion, as many places of worship fail to allow same-sex marriage, ordination, welcome the queer community into the space, and at their worst, engage in explicit homophobia and transphobia. For example, quoting scripture. Here are some poll numbers that they provide. The reason these poll numbers are very important is because this is the information they are going to use to justify their attack on Canadian religious communities that still hold to traditional values. That is why this report was commissioned. And they laid it out very explicitly in the problem section. So 54% of 2S LGBTQ plus folks, I'm not going to say the whole acronym every time, 54% of LGBT folks have experienced homophobia or transphobia in their places of worship. 39% of LGBT folks who do not currently practice but have in the past personally experienced or witnessed homophobia from their former place of worship. And then they have a note there, three times more than that of heterosexual identifying respondents, 13% of whom have personally experienced or witnessed homophobia. 88% of LGBT folks who have never practiced religion, who believe either that faith communities are unsafe for the queer community. 85% of heterosexual respondents feel the same. Now, of course, this has a lot to do with how we're portrayed in the press. If the media is covering a Christian institution, are they covering the immense amount of charitable work Christian institutions do? Are they going to cover the fact, like a Christian school, sponsored some roads and the kids were out picking up garbage? Or are they going to break the insane story that a Christian university still holds to Christian standards? Whenever Christian institutions get covered in the Canadian press, it's virtually always presented as a conflict between the sexual revolution and traditional Christian sexual ethics in almost every instance. And so media coverage of Trinity Western University, Redeemer University, churches that still hold to the traditional biblical ethic, all of these stories are presented as breaking news. Like breaking news, they haven't changed their mind in 2,000 years on this because the Bible, which is even older, details exactly how we should live. And so this impression comes directly from the media. And you'll notice, so the media shapes impressions. The government commissions polling to see those impressions. And this polling is used as evidence that there is a problem in the church. It's an incredibly well thought out plan. But as Peter Hitchens once said, polls are just as often taken to shape public opinion as they are to measure it. Few more polls here. 29% of respondents who say homophobia, transphobia has been directed at someone in their presence. Again, this is in a place of worship. 55% respondents who have never practiced religion state that religion has been used as a justification for homophobia or transphobia directed at them or someone in their presence. Now, for those of you who are thinking, well, there really is such a thing as homophobia. There really is such a thing as expressing hatred towards somebody who identifies as LGBT. Yes, fair enough. But how did they define it back up when they discussed the problem? Churches that refuse to endorse same-sex marriage or endorse the ordination of people who identify as LGBT. That is how they defined it, not how I'm defining it. And so when they're talking about homophobia and transphobia, we have to ask ourselves, what do they mean? Well, they've told us. 44% of 18 to 24-year-olds, and that's a pretty scary number, say that religion has been used as a justification for homophobia or transphobia. This, of course, is a testament to our place of education. Then this report details which percentage of churches and religious communities allow same-sex marriage, allow same-sex ordination, welcomes the trans community, welcomes the 2S LGBTQ plus community, and then could do more to welcome the 2S LGBTQ plus community. So, you've maybe changed your mind on ordination and same-sex marriage, but are you happy about it? Are you flying the flag? This is really important for what they're saying here. These metrics, what they're using as a metric is incredibly interesting. Now, keep in mind that the places that are homophobic, as in don't allow same-sex ordination or same-sex marriage, those places, by virtue of holding those views, are directly contributing to people committing suicide or having mental illness. So this report is incredibly sinister, but it's just buried in all kinds of cheery graphs. So the report is divided into 4 sections, and The report argues that this is the uncertainty is stemming from intentional ambiguity. I'm not going to read that paragraph because there's a lot of stuff in here that we need to really get to. Because there's so much stuff in this report. And again, almost nobody in the Christian community is aware of this report or has read this report, but they're talking about us. They're talking about churches that hold to an orthodox biblical position. And they're talking about it because they're laying the groundwork to specifically target those institutions who don't want to raise the rainbow flag, right? Again, they even track the churches who could do more to be welcoming, right? This is sort of a nice little church there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. And now they've got so they have section 1 is about lived experience. And they kind of summarize all different ways that queer folk currently attending non-affirming places of worship are excluded, and that the non-affirming approach, which would be, again, holding to biblical orthodoxy, is widely accepted and normalized by other congregants. Look, it's very interesting to see progressive language applied to the way churches actually practice their faith with deliberate regard to what the Bible actually teaches. And here's just a few quotes that they give. So here's one from somebody who went to a church. Marriage between same-sex couples is not recognized and dating is not encouraged either. They prefer that if you have feelings towards the same sex to not act on them. This is an example of the traumatic lived experiences from a 2S LGBTQ plus Muslim, which according to this report is a thing that exists. It is a mosque that's misspelled. No, I think they meant in a mosque, these issues are either considered forbidden or are simply not acknowledged. Sorry, that quote was kind of ambiguous here. But basically, you'll notice what they're doing here, right? If Islam forbids homosexuality or Christianity forbids homosexuality, they're saying, well, we found a 2S LGBTQ plus Muslim who actually does endorse these behaviors, so he's a better Muslim than the other Muslims. See, we found a 2S LGBTQ plus Christian, and he or she practices these behaviors, and so he or she is a better Christian than the ones who don't affirm this. It's a really, really clever way of making it sound like those who are holding to biblical orthodoxy simply aren't Christian enough. A Jewish person identified as a 2S LGBTQ plus Jewish person notes that part of the trauma here is not participating in pride, not explicitly welcoming us, no rainbow flag, no marriages, debating our existence in the bane of ethics. In other words, I assume this probably means the ethics of gender identity is somebody who identifies as a male who identifies as female, a female. Questions like that. And so there are all kinds of different specifics here. There's a Protestant identified as heterosexual who said, obviously there is no place for pride in the congregation of those saved by grace. This is cited as an example of homophobia. Here's a Roman Catholic quote: God created them man and woman, and what they are doing now is disgusting. I believe that was a reference to the things that happen at a pride parade. So there's pages and pages of these quotes. And then quotes, of course, the counter, next page, you've got a 2S LGBTQ plus Roman Catholic who says, it didn't make me feel included, and that's why I left, citing traumatic experiences. So on and on and on it goes. And what is so interesting is that so many of the things that they identify here actually are just standard Christian beliefs and has been for a very, very long time. Now, you might ask, what is this report driving towards? So what standard are they judging places of worship against? Because I do totally confess that there can be people who identify as LGBT who are genuinely bullied, who are genuinely treated badly, who are genuinely ostracized, and that there are people who have acted cruelly. But what does this report define as affirming versus non-affirming? And so they provide that information for us on page 18 of the report. The title is in all bold: to be an affirming place of worship, there are minimum requirements that must be met, including, here are their 3 bullet points: same-sex marriage, ordination, and zero tolerance policy for discrimination. What do they mean by discrimination? I refer you to points 1 and 2. Then they said, on top of that, so again, we're still with minimum requirements here. On top of that, places of worship must create a safe and welcoming atmosphere for queer folks. Some ways to demonstrate this inclusive representation, including queer folks in positions of power and high visibility, like the choir, signs and symbols, pride flags, explicit and clear messaging about the inclusion of queer folks in the place of worship itself or on the website. So put your little rainbow flag somewhere. This study demonstrates that there are few places of worship that demonstrate all of these qualities, which means they're all classified as non-affirming and a problem, and that these non-affirming places are genuinely driving an enormous amount of distress in the LGBT community. Many inclusive places also have some work to do. There's always more work to do when it comes to more clearly articulating their inclusion of queer folks in these spaces. Conversely, many places of worship are not safe or inclusive spaces for the 2S LGBTQ plus community, and some of these places are more explicit in their exclusion, while others take a more insidious route and attempt to confuse with unclear messaging about how they see homosexuality as sinful. So notice here that the most insidious route that they can do is saying that homosexuality is sinful. Now, what does that mean for any church that holds to an orthodox understanding of sexuality as laid out in Scripture? You're the target of this report. You are the problem. Your institution is the problem. Your ministry, your church, they are the problem. And how does that problem get addressed? Well, as I said at the beginning of the Bridgehead briefing today, you've got activists like Mac Moreau who are openly saying these churches should be tax-exempt status removed, charitable status removed, and they should be essentially eliminated because they are places of bigotry. And this is kind of how it starts. And the spectrum of discrimination, they start on the left-hand side with active exclusion, explicit and deliberate exclusion. Then second is homosexuality as a sin. And they cite the problem as love the sin or hate the sin mentality as the problem. Then there's limitations, which limits opportunities for marriage and or leadership. Now, on the other side, inclusionary, all are welcome for real. Zero tolerance for discrimination, more muted in their inclusion. But then the one at the very end is active inclusion, explicit and deliberate inclusion, which basically means an overt celebration of queerness, as they defined it here. So that kind of gives you an idea of the crisis that's headed towards Canadian churches. The groundwork has been laid for a long time. There are LGBT activists who are going through sermon libraries that are looking at the content churches put online, and they are cataloging this stuff. And then when the time is right, they're launching campaigns. So, one of the priests at the Roman Catholic Archdiocese in Calgary found this out because they put their sermons online for their parishioners to listen to, not realizing that when you put something on the internet, you're speaking to everybody. And some of those people are going to be recording what you say to use it against you. Why? Because as this government-funded and facilitated report indicates, you are a non-affirming and therefore dangerous space if you don't allow same-sex ordination, same-sex marriage, and overtly and actively welcome queerness. Same thing, Calvary Baptist Church. If you were in an open same-sex relationship, then you can't be on the membership rolls. You can still attend church, etc. That makes Calvary Baptist Church a dangerous place. That's traumatizing the 2S LGBTQ plus community according to this report. And so we're seeing what's taking place. I've said for a very long time that as Canada becomes increasingly post-Christian, we are facing a scenario under which the kind of sand is running out of the hourglass. Charitable status is going to be pulled. Tax-exempt status is going to be pulled because the mainline churches, which have basically collapsed, right? A study that came out of Wilfrid Laurier University a couple of years ago indicated that the churches that hoist the pride flag are emptying out. People aren't going there anymore because why are you going to get up early on Sunday morning to go to a service where nothing you hear is any different than you would hear from a secular LGBT activist, right? Most people aren't going to church for that. But it's churches that hold to orthodoxy that are actually growing. And so, Michael Corn can turn the lights off in the Anglican church when it's finally completely empty. But what we're seeing here is that one of the ways the government's addressing this is affirming those dying churches as real churches, and then affirming churches that hold to orthodoxy as a problem. We are literally cited as a problem at the beginning of this government report. And what are the recommendations? Well, there's some takeaways here. The key takeaway, there's a long way to go to make these spaces, that's churches, more inclusive and safe for the queer community. Not only is work needed to make the exclusionary places of worship more inclusionary and upfront about their stance, but there is also some work to do on the inclusionary side to help these spaces be more clear that they are, in fact, safe spaces for the 2S LGBTQ plus community. And what are the recommendations? Basically, they give a whole bunch of different advice for things that you can do. So you should change your beliefs on whether or not homosexuality is a sin. You should hoist the pride flag. You should be proactively affirming. And then they end with a summary of the state of Canadian churches, and let us say they are not very optimistic. What does this all mean? Again, I think there is a crisis heading towards Canadian churches that most Canadian churches are totally unprepared for. That there are activists who are compiling information. This information is being used. The government is commissioning reports on what is going on inside churches and identifying traditional Christian churches as a problem that needs to be addressed. How are they going to address this problem? Financial pressure is one of the ways, which is why recommendation 430 in a report from the Standing Committee on Finance, the initial budget 2025 report, actually recommended just simply removing tax-exempt status from places of worship. That's what's coming our way, and Canadian churches need to be prepared for this. And we need to be thinking about it, and we need to look at what our government is saying about us when they think that we're not listening. Thank you for listening to or watching this episode of the Bridgehead Briefing. We hope you found it helpful. If you did find it helpful, please do share it around. I do think it's important for people to know this information. If you have any questions or you just want to help boost this video, please do like it or leave a comment. And if you have any topics you think we should be covering, do drop those in the comments and we'll take a look.